Someone asked, we went to Yale together. We went to that school in New Haven.
We were supposed to have our 25th reunion this year, but it wasn't in person. Yeah, exactly. Hi, Gail. Hi, Eileen. Hi, Barbara. Hi, Karen. Hi, Irene. Hi, Marilyn. People all over. This is so nice.
I had all these clothes for my book tour, and I just don't know when they'll ever be used. Oh, neat.
Okay, let me just put notes up here. Okay, so I think I'm gonna get us started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Quarantine-ish Book Talks. What was once the Quarantine Book Talks. We're hoping we're moving away from quarantine into something that is something else. So we'll call it Quarantine-ish Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I'm so excited to be back with all of you after our hiatus. Our history course last month was fabulous, and we have a great month of Quarantine Book Talks sessions coming up, with many more to come in the fall. So this should just be the beginning of a lot of wonderful conversations and learning together. Just a word about the Jewish Women's Archive. We are a digital archive that helps expand the Jewish narrative by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We draw on the richness of our history for insight about the world today. And this is just one of many different kinds of programs and resources that we offer. So I encourage you to check out jwa.org. A moment of logistics before I introduce our author for tonight. As you've seen, some people are introducing themselves in the chat box. Please go ahead and do that. We love to see who's with us and where people are from. And please, please, please also share questions in the chat box, and I will bring them into our conversation. So I am thrilled to introduce Lizzie Skurnick, who, as you heard, is an old friend, as well as an author, more importantly, an author, editor, and critic, whose most recent book is called Pretty Bitches on Being Called Crazy, Angry, Bossy, Frumpy, Feisty, and all the other words that are used to undermine women. And the truth is, this book could be a very, very long book, because there are a lot of words like that. And we'll have a chance to talk about that. She's also the author of That Should Be a Word, a much needed lexicon for the modern era. And some of you may remember that column in the New York Times. And also Shelf Discovery, the teen classics we'll never stop reading. And Lizzie is an expert in young adult literature and the founding editor of Lizzie Skurnick Books, and which has reissued dozens of YA classics, including the All the Kind family series. She's a frequent contributor to the New York Times, NPR, Elle, Jezebel, and many other publications. She's also been featured on JWA's podcast in our episode about single mothers by choice. So we have so many things to talk about. Welcome, Lizzie. So glad that you're here with us tonight.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book.
Well, you know, I wrote that first book about words, and then I had a second book to do. And it was right after Hillary Clinton lost, tragically, in a horrible way. And it made me start to think about the power of words, just thinking about what she had been called, you know, even small things. The word that I just kept hearing about her over and over and over again was flawed, flawed, flawed. Everybody would compliment her and then say, although she's a flawed candidate. And I was like, this is going to have an effect. Everybody has to stop doing this reflex.
As opposed to the rest of us who are not flawed.
We're not flawed, exactly. And that just made me start thinking about, you know, these sort of semi-neutral words that have an effect on our lives, words that seem like they're compliments, like pretty, words that seem like, you know, smart, that, you know, like that's supposed to be a compliment, or just outright mean words like ugly, you know. And one woman, when I was talking to writers about doing it, one woman suggested 2. She had always been told she was too much, too talkative, too questioning, too this. And that really just set the direction of the book for me, that we're basically just always taught that what we are is not okay, and that we're imposing in some way on someone else's life by just being ourselves. And so it was very freeing to write the book. I remember after I got in all the essays from people, I felt better. I felt like I can put this word away now. I can put princess away, or small away, or big away, or just anything. This word has been like locking me down and I didn't even notice.
There was a place in the book, I think it was in Katha Pollitt's piece about the word feisty, where she talks about,
yes,
people calling her that, and she's trying not to seem feisty or angry. And she says, in my heart, though, I seethed, which I think, to me, that like so resonated. There were so many things in this book, I have to say, that I was like underlining so hard. I actually broke the tip of my pencil twice, I think, while underlining this book. And I'm not usually like a vigorous hard presser, but I was just like, yes, yes. And I felt like that line really resonated with me, because I think it describes how so many women react to the words that are used to describe us. We like sort of smile on the outside and inside seethe. And I love that this book just invited women to say and like speak out and put into such articulate words what they really feel and think about these terms that get kind of bandied about as if they're just a joke and, haha, lighthearted all the time.
Yeah. And what I loved is that, I had a list. When I started, I was like, well, let me just have a list of, say 800 words that we hate to be called. And every woman had a word that I didn't expect, and even that they didn't expect. Like one woman wrote about lucky, a friend of mine who's single, and how lucky was, which sounds so great, was really weaponized against her to make it seem like she hadn't worked for what she had. And, there was also small, which, and Bitch Beth wrote about how that was a compliment, but also not a compliment, and also meant to talk about how she was foreign, but also, and that it was just, even though it seems like this little neutral thing, this small thing, it was like this, wedding cake of a word in her life.
Yeah, and there's this place where you write in the introduction, which I thought was so smart, where this book is obviously about the power of language and how these words can function as these, what we might now call microaggressions, which of course I even feel like the term microaggression sort of, makes it seem like it's no big deal. It's just something small, right? And I think you call it like pinpricks. But then you point out that these words actually aren't just the pinpricks themselves. They function as this justification for much bigger, horrible things that happen to women. And so that there's a way in which these things are not just annoying, they actually like undergird systemic inequality.
Yes, exactly. So that, because you can't say, she's a bitch, you just say she's too loud. And, that's not all that it entails, though. That's why you don't get the job. That's why you don't get the promotion. That's why, your friend isn't nice to you. That's why no one is listening to you. And so, like, I always remember a boss who, he used to always say to me that, I'm not even sure what he said. It was various two things. And he sexually harassed me. He felt me up. Like, he was just horrible. He was always asking me to lunch. It was totally blatant, but it was like 1996. So there's nothing I can do about it. And I always think, it's not personal. My feelings are not hurt. I lost a matching 401k that is probably worth $300,000 now. Like, I'm a single mom. And so that I also wanted to show that it's not about our feelings, even though feelings are important, but it's about taking away our independence in the world, taking away how we can have jobs or, have our roles that give us freedom and power. That these words are sort of the means to take all that away from us. And that's what's even worse.
Right, that there's something really measurable that comes out of this. When we're talking about the power of language, it's not just the power to hurt people in, in terms of like insult them. It's actually, there's like measurable, quantitative impact on people's lives.
Oh, absolutely. Like even my feelings, I remember when he did it, my feelings weren't hurt. I just got panicked. I knew he was going to fire me and that there was nothing I could do about it. And that, you know, it was terrifying.
You mentioned the term small and how it also had this kind of, you know, it referred to someone's ethnic or racial identity or immigrant status. And that was one of the things that I think also came through in so many of these pieces, is that these words are not only gendered, you're writing about them in a sort of how they're used in a gendered context, but they also have these other ways in which they're working to point out difference. And, you know, so you wrote about Zoftig, and we'll get to that in a minute, but there's also other words that are talked about here, exotic and yellow bone, and words that are, you know, that do other kinds of work.
Oh yeah, like Afua Hirsch, who is half Black and half Jewish, wrote about professional and how that word was really, you know, it was like about her hair. Everybody always said like, oh, your hair, you know, this kind of, you know, that your hair is too long or it has to be too straight or da da da. But what it was really about telling her is like, you don't look like a white man. Therefore, you are unprofessional, whatever you do.
Right.
So finally, like, you know, she goes through her entire career, and she was like, finally, a man told me my legs were too muscular on camera. And I just said, that's it. I cannot win this game. I can't have non-muscular legs. I don't know what he's talking about, but I'm just going to be myself because I can't win this fight. And I think that was also what was so great about the book for me. It was like, we can't win this. We can't argue our way out of this. So let's stop. Let's just look at this for what it is and oppose it and not try to, you know, mitigate it in any way anymore.
Right. And do you think like that writing, and maybe you can answer this through talking about your piece, but do you think that writing these essays help people like make their peace with these words? Or, I mean, I guess maybe it's different for different people, or kind of like, you know, let go whatever kind of tension they had around it?
Yes, everyone said it was totally cleansing. And actually, a lot of people had a hard time ending the essay because so many of the endings for the essay were like, I never thought about this before, and now I feel better. So, you know, it was very strange that even just the act of talking about the word and the effect the word really had, and not ignoring the word. You know, whether it is Jennifer Weiner talking about fat, which is an outright insult, obviously, or, you know, Jillian Medoff talking about mature, and, you know, how at first that was sexualizing and now it's desexualizing. You know, it was as if not being able to object had really been holding us back, actually. So, you know, my cousin, who's an older man, he's 70, very, very conservative. He actually read the book and liked it and presented it to his book club, and he felt it was amazing. And he said he felt like he finally had a different perspective, like it actually made him understand why various words are annoying to women and what they mean. And I was like, okay, if this can affect my cousin, you know. Right. So it's not like, by the way, not that there's anything wrong with being angry, and angry is one of those words, but right. It's actually not. It's a thoughtful book. You know, right. It's people sort of ruminating, like, what did this word do to my life?
And also I felt like it was almost like it felt to me almost sort of like a consciousness raising group. It's very much like the personal is political, like all these people who've been called these words and being like, oh, this is annoying to me. And then being like, oh, it's not just annoying to me, or it's not just used against me. This is like a shared experience. And it totally is part of a larger system of the way that women get put in their place. And it's not just like a random thing.
Right. It's not just one mean person trying to shut you up at that minute. It's right. Actually, you know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg not being allowed to argue in front of the Supreme Court, you know.
Right. So let's have you read a little piece of your piece on Zoftig. Molly Ann has asked for an excerpt. And we've got some good questions already too, which we'll.
All right, I may have to adjust my reading glasses here. So I'm going to read right from the beginning. Oh, actually, you know what? I'm going to read a little bit about the cultural history of Zaftig as I knew it as a child. Okay. The first time most non-Jews likely heard the word Zaftig, at least on a regular basis, was during the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Then it was practically a byword for the girl herself. Ah, the American public said, this is how you describe the subtle heft of that girl in a black beret, bobbing along in the crowd to meet the president, her eyes both acquisitive and alight. Her one-time date, Jake Tapper, illustrated how to apply the qualification. She was cute, he said, if a little Zaftig. Then, when people said Zaftig, Jews and Gentiles alike, they meant a regrettable, if tolerable, weight. It was the 15 pounds you could put a positive spin on, like pleasantly plump, voluptuous, or curvy. Unlike goy and shiksa, Yiddish terms of derision that became jokes everyone was in on, Zaftig was now an insult that everyone knew. It wasn't as bad as such a pretty face, but you could see it from there. Now, in America, Zaftig has come to mean almost anything, that is, anything that's not skeletal. Google the word and you will find a New York skyline of bodies. Size XXXLs have reclaimed it, much like curvy, in the name of body positivity. Large size models, which is to say average size women, stride down the runways, looking unlike coat hangers. Hippie chicks show off cleavage and generous hips. It's all unabashedly sexual. The women preen and vamp like pinups, sporting skimpy bordello wear, lots of bare flesh and spikes. All this confusion is strange because Zaftig, which incidentally is pronounced more like Zaftig, does have a precise meaning. It just means juicy. It's not about being fat, curvy, busty, or even well molded. It's not about boobs, breasts, or size or heft. It's not something you can weigh or something you can diet away. Zaft means juice or sap, and Zaftig means full to bursting, delectable. It's explicitly sexual, and it's approving. It's not, as Jake Tapper suggested, something that detracts from hotness. Zaftig embodies it.
Nice. It is a great reframe, and how hard it is for us to not hear the things that we associate with the term, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that was what was so strange to me, because what I didn't read from the beginning is what brought me to Zaftig really is that my grandma Dora, once after I had come back from a run during a time when I had an eating disorder and was quite thin, looked at me and she very approvingly said, "Oh, Zaftig." And I was like, "Oh my God, Grandma, you just called me fat." And she got enraged at me, not enraged, but she got mad and she said, "Zaftig doesn't mean fat, it means strong." And Yiddish was her native language. And my grandma really was very rude about fat people also. You know, a fat person would be walking down the street and she would say, "Oh, there's a candidate for Weight Watchers." Like, she was not
Not subtle, right?
I knew she was not insulting me, but that has been my relationship. I've been trying to figure out now for it's like 30 years what the hell she meant. And this essay was really my journey into Zaftig and trying to reclaim Zaftig in a way that wasn't about sex and wasn't about fat, but was about being strong.
What do you think about, I'm thinking about the term booty in that regard. My daughter, who is 13, recently, I have twins who are 13, and my daughter recently said to me, "I'm really glad I'm a teenager in a time when people are allowed to have some booty." She's like, "I don't think I would do well in a time where people are supposed to be like sticks." I was like, okay, I'm glad you feel that way. that made me really happy.
Yeah, it's, it's strange. This is going slightly off topic, but I'm not sure the audience knows I'm half Black and half Jewish. So a friend of mine who's from the South and white and a police officer, and she was a white police officer, but she had a Black partner. And she said, "Oh, well, if I say he has a big butt, and then he says I have a flat butt, and what's wrong with that? Like, why can't we have that joke?" And so then I had to describe to her the real history of Black people and butts in this country, which has to do with, the Venus Hottentot, this for those who don't know, this, woman stolen from Africa and shown all over
Right, on
Europe,
display. Yeah.
on display with her buttocks, and she was interested in learning that. And so with each generation, I remember as I was growing up, I was had a very hard time because I would, the song I Like Big Butts, it just seemed like as I was growing up, white people thought that was hysterical, as if like that's a song we do at a wedding. Like, what could be funnier than that? And, it was really like a form of derision. And what they didn't understand is that the song was actually affectionate. And that was a hard thing to negotiate. I always felt like it's lucky I went to a majority Black high school, because I felt like, but my white friends are obsessed with their butts being too big, and it's just something that is, it's like every generation basically negotiates the question of how big your butt should be in the United States.
Right.
So, it's not the marker that I took on with Zaftig, but I think it's another one
it's another one that's there. We had a question about one of the slurs of this moment, Karen. What do you think about, you don't have any sort of like names or types in this book, but what do you think about that as a word that's used to put down women of a particular type, I guess?
Well, I feel like this about Karen. Karen seems to be used to describe a kind of behavior. It's not meant towards white women. It's meant towards white women that behave a certain way, and a way that exists as a trope in our culture, as something that goes all the way back to, Emmett Till. And you see the character, it's probably not nice. But I think, and what a lot of people on Twitter, which I recently am addicted to, have actually pointed out is, which I think is interesting, is that it's when white men have kind of taken to use it, and they just mean it as a misogynistic, insult. And, they refer to any white woman as Karen just when they don't like what she's doing. And so it's morphed to this thing that originally was about racial dynamics and what you do about them into this way to just insult people. So I guess the way I feel about Karen is, it is an unexplored, I think it's good for Americans to see, on Twitter, the kind of behavior, that Amy Cooper, exhibited, just to see what Black men and Black women, and just people of color in general, have to put up with. But I don't know, as it's hard because I don't want to say like, and that's great, it's fine, because I'm sure it's not nice if you're worried about being called a Karen. So, but I guess what I would say is it seems like a good time to look into that behavior and see what it means, and maybe not worry about the word so much, because it is a word used to describe behavior, not people, and that is really different. But I do think white men should stop using it, because they are using it as a slur and as a misogynistic slur, and it's not a word for them.
So for people who want to think a little bit about the context and sort of what it means to reckon with whiteness as a Karen, we actually published a great piece on our blog this week, and I just put it in the chat, called Calling Out Karens in the Jewish Community. And it was written by one of our interns who really talked about exactly that, just that like, this is if the term bothers you, it's worth thinking about what it actually means and where the truth is, whether it's true for you or not, to kind of think about where that kernel is.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's a term, the term doesn't have history, but the dynamic has history.
Right.
And, it is something we need to think about. Like, my son is 6, but, he has asked me a lot about, what's happening with police violence, and I've had to describe like the slave patrols to him and that kind of thing, just so he understands the history. And I think for people interested in Karen, going back and, you know, it's a good time to like read history about how white womanhood, you know, has been used against Black people to the detriment of everybody. Not great for white women either. So, you know, I would say that Karen is a good opportunity for that.
And so this is a lighter term and question, but how are you feeling about the acceptance of irregardless by the dictionary this week?
So annoying. It's stupid. It's like I because, you know, as someone who makes up words, which I did for a living. Oh yeah, Karen, Karen.
Yes, the name Karen.
The name Karen. I think somebody put the Wikipedia. You know, there's no, I love change in language. There's no reason if people are just literally using something incorrectly, just how people literally sometimes use literally
yes,
wrong, you know, it's not adding anything. It's like saying, you know, it's okay to walk around with one shoe.
And right, it's like, giving up. Really? It's giving up. Yeah.
It's like, it's not really okay to walk around with one shoe. So let's not pretend it is.
Yeah. I know. I was sort of like, what's happening? 2020, this year sucks. Come on.
I know. We even lost irregardless.
Yeah.
That's, you know.
I know. It's like, it's crazy. So let's maybe shift gears and talk a little bit about your work with Lizzie Skurnick Books and, you know, your in general, your work around YA writing. So how did you, first of all, become a kind of critic and expert and publisher of YA literature?
Well, it really was because of the invention of blogs. You know, I met my friend Anna Holmes, who was the publisher of Jezebel, a new blog at the time. And she said, you know, I'm looking for someone to write a column on all the YA we loved. And I was like, great, because that's what I was going to pitch you on. I want to write about it. You know, we have this whole generation of women who grew up on all this literature, a lot of it by women. And
there was a little bit of static, but it's better now.
It's better now. Okay. And so I started going through all these authors that we loved, but that weren't in sort of the canon, you know, like Lois Duncan or Sydney Taylor, or, you know, some less well-known authors, you know, that I had grown up and loved. You know, a lot of the books by men were still in print for YA. Even if they weren't well known, they were still in print, but there were so many books by women out of print. And so the column was just a way to celebrate them and revive them. And, you know, then that became a book. And I got to write about every book I really wanted to write about. And then someone asked if I wanted to curate a series, and that became Lizzie Skurnick Books. And so I spent a few years really hunting down the rights to books that were out of print. And what was great is that because I had this column, people came to me sometimes with books that were going out of print. So June Cummins, who has who's very sadly deceased now, but she has a forthcoming book about Sydney Taylor coming out. She contacted me and let me know that the publishers were letting the All the Kind family books go out of print except for the first one. And I was like, well, that can't happen. And so those were some of the first books we got and took and published. And so and those, you know, those are still in print, but it's interesting. Even some of the ones I brought back into print immediately went out of print. It's very hard to keep female writers, you know, for girls in print.
That's so sad. Yeah, I mean, I saved so many of those books and gave my kids my copies, but it was exciting to buy when you republished All of a Kind family books. I bought those a lot as gifts for people because I grew up with those and loved those. And we actually did some events together talking about the impact, sort of intergenerational panels talking about the impact of All of a Kind family. Why do you think those books are so beloved and still so resonant for people?
Well, I think for several reasons. First of all, I think that they're so tactile. They allow you to really feel and see and experience this world of, you know, what the dresses were like, or what the house looked like, or what they sold at the market. And that's and so it I think people enjoyed getting to know that world. It's such a hidden world. And also I think it's the story of immigrants and change, and, you know, everybody, and it's the story of sisters. And so that's just always something young girls and boys want to read about, you know, just the normal growing up things like school, or, you know, how you steal something, or if you're, you know, like too nice, or if you fall asleep on a test. You know, a lot of what the books I republished had in common that's sort of different from books now is that, or the sort of dystopia trend is that they really talked about how large, small events loom in the lives of children. You know, like if you don't finish your dinner, there's the episode where I think it's Sarah doesn't want to finish her dinner, and, you know, and that goes on for like a day, you know, an entire day, and it's a whole family thing. You know, those things are actually a huge part of our personhood and history. You know, you don't have to be going through, I mean, God forbid we're in like a dystopic mess right now, but you don't have to be going through that for your world to change. And so I think that those books really spoke to the small physical details, but also the small emotional details that loom so large for us growing up. And that's why they're so, you know, dear to us.
Yeah, and so many of the adventures, like there's such a sense of adventure and like going to, you know,
Coney Island,
right, or even to like
downtown.
to Papa's basement, you know, where
Yes.
he's a peddler or rag picker or whatever, and going and like
Yes.
going through the trash, basically, you know, sort of. But I remember feeling that way as a kid, just how exciting it was to sit in my mom's office and like play with the legal pads or whatever, and just all the drama you can make up out of exploring in some place where you're not used to being.
And also, you know, the girls, when you read it as an adult, and whenever I teach these books, it's so funny, you know, they're so poor. And the books are really about poverty, but they're about how a child experiences poverty, which is that they don't notice it at all. Like the rags are very exciting. It has so much to do with how a parent handles want, you know. And so I think that's also why they're important generationally. You read it as a kid and you're paying attention to, oh, what if I burn my dress? And then you read it as a mother and you're like, oh, like whether or not you can afford a new dress or new stockings, it's such a thing that you think about, making enough for your child. So I think that's also why parents want to share the books with their children.
Yeah, absolutely. There's something very except for the part where Guido dies, there's something very comforting about them. Like even my son, who is 13, and he would probably be embarrassed that I'm sharing this, but sometimes when he can't fall asleep at night, he listens to the audiobook of All of a Kind Family. Like he finds it very calming somehow, because it is just sort of like the rhythms of everyday life. And I mean, and we know from research that like here, I mean, this is true of family stories more broadly, this really about people's own family stories, but that hearing about stories, even if when they're stories of hardship, teaches resilience, because you learn that you can overcome hardship. And I think in some ways, All of a Kind Family can function that way too, that there's a sense that even the things that are hard, they move through them in a way that's not minimizing it, but also not scary.
Yeah. And that you even, I mean, there's quite a few serious adult things that happen. You know, you have Lena the Greena, you know, who gets polio. And, you know, and then you do have Guido's mother who dies, you know, you have the boyfriend going to war. And there's a lot of very deep stuff in that, but written in a way that a child can understand.
What do you think are the young adult books now that will be classics in that way?
Oh my God, that's such a big question.
I know.
The adult books now or the teen books now?
I guess the teen books now.
Oh God, I'm such a bad teen reader now. I only read vintage teen novels. I mean, I guess though, maybe I mean, I think Wolf Hall is a classic, but I think Wolf Hall will be like a classic novel. But I do think in a way, sort of drawing a line to my adult reading, you know, from my childhood reading, you know, I do notice now how much I love historical fiction, you know, books like Paulette Giles' The Color of Lightning, you know, which is about this famous Black cowboy Britt Johnson, or books like Wolf Hall, or, you know, and I do think that comes from that tradition of female writers depicting the lives of girls so precisely and keeping these details that otherwise would be totally lost to us. And I think I admire that now. I mean, I think that's why I love historical fiction, even if it's not, you know, even if it's not about young girls. What's the one catch-all name for white men who are racist and violent? I don't know.
Yeah, it's true. We don't have the same. We label women differently.
Yes, absolutely.
For sure.
Absolutely.
What are some of the books that you would like to see come re-released or come out? Some of your favorites that might not have been republished yet?
Oh, that haven't been republished yet. Well, I did a pretty good job of getting all of the ones out that I wanted. But, you know, I did always want to get The Great Brains, which for those of you who have boys are sort of, is about a family growing up in a Mormon community in Utah. Very funny, very detailed, very funny like episodes. And, you know, that I didn't get to publish many books with, you know, for boys with male leads, which was not personal. It's just those books are still in print. But people always wanted, oh, it's The Great Brains, the Great Brains series. Oh, yes, those. The Lady Grey, yeah, the Lady Jane Grey book. I can't remember that, but yes, that is like ringing a bell for me. So The Great Brains were very sad. Those got away from me. I really wanted to republish a lot of the Emmy Kerr books, and she just wanted to. She just wanted to be digital, you know. And
you did one though, didn't you? Did you do one? I
did. We did one. We did I'll Love You When You're More Like Me, which is great. But if I had had my way, I would have re-released, you know, her entire library. And that's also always the fun. Oh, I would have re-released Paul Zindel.
I loved her. Yeah, I love Paul Zindel.
Yes.
And Paula Danziger also was a favorite of mine. I don't know
Paula
if those are still in print.
No, they're not. And Ellen Conford, whom I adored, and you know, she wrote,
recently died, right?
Yeah. Yes, she recently died, and she wrote What's Wrong with Me? Hail, Hail, Camp Timberland, you know, and we are, you know, all of those writers, it was very sad because a lot of the writers that we published, you know, like Lois Duncan and Ellen Comfort, they actually died in the course of, you know, our publishing life together. And that was also what was very important for me, because I felt like a lot of these women were older women, and, you know, publishing had just sort of, you know, publishing is not that interested in older women writing about young girls. It's just, you know, not a thing. And so I was so glad to be able to honor them. They were very, oh, I feel terrible. I feel like maybe this is my connection that's doing this.
It's been intermittent. I don't think we've missed too much, but there's some little zips.
Okay. It's Jersey City's internet. I apologize.
You can always blame New Jersey.
Yes.
I always loved Norma Klein. She was one of my favorites. But I think that those books are too 70s and too sexual to be reprinted now, probably. But that was part of what I loved about them, is that the kids were not, you know, they were sort of like free agents wandering Manhattan, and it was like
having sex
right.
Yeah. Yes, there was a lot. I remember with Norma Klein, that I think it was she who sort of, I had forgotten how during the 70s, this thing about it being healthier to be naked around your children was like a thing. And, you know, there's one part in a Norma Klein novel where an aunt like always showers with her kids and lets them play with her breasts, just like not in a sexual way,
right? Just to be comfortable with your body.
Just to be, and I was like, wow, that really would not fly nowadays.
No. So Randy made a very good point about All of a Kind Family, which I think is really worth stating, which is that part of what was so groundbreaking about those books was that they were explicitly about a Jewish family. So they weren't sort of like universalizing, covering up the Jewishness of the family, but they also were bringing Jewishness to a much, much broader audience.
Absolutely. And the books we reissued, June Cummins writes quite a bit about how, there was the character of the librarian was actually inserted by the white editor. She wanted there to be a more American, meaning, blonde, blue-eyed couple in there so that other readers could relate to the Jewish family, because it was actually the Rosenbergs had just been found guilty and executed. So it was not a good time for Jews. And she was trying to, yeah, exactly.
Are you saying that Charlie and the library lady weren't real?
Nope.
Oh, that's so sad.
Inserted so that, so that Gentiles could, and June also writes a lot. And it's the only reason I make no money from my editions. I just recommend buying them because of June's great intros. But she talks a lot about how Taylor inserted sort of secret communist stuff in the books. Also, Taylor was also a communist, and that she had to hide that a lot in the books. And that's why the All of a Kind Family Downtown was actually the second book she turned in. And her editor wouldn't publish it at the time. She said it was too dark, and that was the one where she really was trying to take on social issues. And so she wrote a few happier ones until the popularity of the series allowed her to publish All of a Kind Family Downtown, which is why the books have that weird out of order thing going on.
Right. I was always confused by that. It's amazing she got them published at all.
Yes,
truthfully.
It is completely amazing. Yeah, it would be great to have a series on Jewish.
Yeah. There are a lot of them.
Shots because I'm like, oh, cool. Her editor, I would have to go open my book, and I am completely forgetting who the editor is. I should have put all my books over here, and so I could tell.
A bunch of them. They're on my shelf.
It should be in that first one. We don't really know how the book was published originally. It's sort of an apocryphal story that her husband submitted it to a contest, and that's how it's published. Other people say that she submitted it, but it was just lucky she got in before the Rosenbergs, because otherwise the books really never would have happened, I think.
Right. So, one of the things that we're having this conversation obviously in the middle of a very tumultuous time in the US, both in terms of the pandemic and in terms of the reckoning around systemic racism that we're in the midst of. And one of the places where that has really, one of the places where we're seeing that kind of playing out is in people recognizing just like how racist publishing is and how little most of us read that is about the experience of people who are not white, and sort of like people are buying all these books trying to grapple with racism. You can't get your hands on some of them now. So are you seeing that have an impact in your world too, of writing and publishing and sort of thinking about young adult books?
Well, so I'm in a sort of like interesting position related to that, because I've been in publishing, since we graduated, since 1996. And in my first job, Mr. Sexual Harasser, also his favorite statement was, well, Black people don't read. There's really no good books by Black people. And what was fascinating, what was fascinating for me and a lot of my friends is we did not know, when I saw that like every other Black person in publishing had also been told that a million times, and that, white people had heard it a million times and not spoken back, which wasn't something I knew. I just thought my boss was obnoxious. And so I think the reading of the books is good. In some ways, I wish people would read more. This is my personal, I wish people would read more history. What I've noticed is people are sort of choosing books about, culture and theory, which is great. Don't get me wrong, but I'm also like, if you just read, you know, Ludell is a book I republished, you know, which is wonderful and is about a Black girl growing up in the South in the 1950s. And it, you know, was never, I just think it's like an iconic work. And I sometimes wish, I feel like you might almost get more out of reading something like Ludell with your daughter than reading White Fragility. Not that there's anything wrong with White Fragility, but I always want to be like, you know, it's interesting to me, I guess now, how people want to be taught how to think, you know, how what they're thinking might be wrong or how what they're feeling might be wrong. And I almost just wish, you know, that they had my, it's called Ludell, Ludell. That they, you know, were reading like Roll Jordan Roll, or, like something about, Harlem Renaissance, or, you know, a novel that was just written by a young Black author this year, you know, something like, you know, Homegoing. And
oh, that's such a good book.
Yeah.
That was one of the best books I've read in the last 5 years, I would say.
Oh, yeah. And because, and I guess this is a good place to say it, actually, I feel like what people don't get to know is that, like, it's really wonderful to be a Black person, and Black culture is great. And we feel really lucky, so that in a way, it's actually a nice time to read a lot of the joyous books about Black history and, you know, Black novels and Black life. And, you know, it doesn't have to be all, you know, white people are bad, agony, you know. I sometimes, I just wish white people got to know more about Black culture, more about the actual Black world, because I feel like, you know, that's sometimes the problem, you know, there's no like inclusion as like we're fellow citizens, we know all about each other, you know. And so I hope people, you know, feel free to read a lot of that stuff too. I think it's almost more helpful than the theory. It's my total personal opinion, but, you know, I think like a nice work of, you know, something like The Good Lord Bird, that's a great fun book by a Black author about John Brown. And, you know, I would read that over White Fragility any day.
Yeah. I'm a big fiction reader too. So I tend to, when these, you know, there've been these conversations on Facebook of people recommending books, and I'm like, I've wondered, like, why are they all nonfiction? It could all, like, and I've put on those lists a lot of the fiction that I love, that, because it does, I think it's the same way that, as we know, we say often at JWA, if you can see it, you can be it, right? And this idea that you need to see representations of things to be able to imagine possibilities. And when the protagonists that we encounter in fiction all are one kind of person, or look a certain way, then we don't think of people, you know, people of color as subjects, as protagonists in their own stories.
And I was so lucky to grow up with both of that. You know, my mom, you know, my mom was Black and my dad was Jewish. And so my mom had everything on the shelf. She was the English professor, but, you know, she had, you know, we had The World the Slaves Made, but she also had, I think it's called Our Crowd, you know, which is about the German Jews of, you know, 19th century New York. And I feel like I just grew up getting to read James Baldwin and Elie Wiesel, you know, and like, you know, Maxine Hall Kingston. And I just feel like, you know, I was actually a little bit shocked, you know, when everyone started sending around those lists. I was like, you guys don't normally try to read that movie, obviously not.
Right.
But, you know, but I guess it's like, you know, it's good. It's not a bad thing. Another book though that I want to recommend that is out of print, but I would love it if everyone would buy it, is there's a biography of Fannie Lou Hamer by the poet June Jordan, and it's a book for children, and it's great. And, you know, my mother had that for me as a child, and I feel like it's really a book of history, but just written for children. And that made me understand so much more than sometimes these like books about race do. It's called Fannie Lou Hamer. Oh yeah, thank you, yeah. And it's great. And you know, I think kids can't always understand something theoretical, but they can read the story of Fannie Lou Hamer and get what happened and, you know, what it meant. It's my quest to get that book republished. It's never going to happen, but
Yeah,
that's the one I really would. Anyone here who can get that book republished.
She was an amazing, amazing woman. Such a just model civil rights activist in Mississippi, and served on one of the delegates to the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party that was turned away from the Democratic National Convention, not seated at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. Instead, the all-white Mississippi delegation was seated. So her story deserves to be known. We have absolutely. A little bit of stuff on our site actually about her in our curriculum on civil rights.
Yes.
There were a lot of young Jews who were inspired by her and worked with her.
Yes, absolutely. It's funny because I've been going through, so I've been researching a lot of my Black family and a lot of my Jewish family. And so I found stuff, you know, all about my Jewish relatives giving money to the Scottsboro Boys and stuff. So it's like you have the communist background. Oh yeah, Just Mercy was great also. You know, but yeah.
You've been doing a lot of really interesting writing in the New York Times recently also. You've had several beautiful pieces, mostly around sort of parenting related stuff, caretaking, a piece about taking care of your mother and your son at the same time. And a recent piece also about taking your son to some of the recent protests and introducing him to mom cops. And I loved that approach. Do you want to talk a little bit about that piece?
Well, so, you know, those first weeks, you know, during the protests, really that first week, you know, after George Floyd was killed, was it was really terrifying. And just because you had this sense of like, where is our country going? What's going to happen on our street? You know, what's going to happen? Like, you know, what are police officers going to do to us if they're scared? You know, what are all these people that might come into the community and like cause mayhem doing? And, you know, Jersey City, for those of you who don't know, it's literally the most diverse city in America. It usually gets that designation, and it's part of the reason I moved here. But, you know, that night, during the first march, the city shut down. I had never seen our downtown shut down like that before. All the grills were down. And it was as if everyone, you know, our local key food was putting down. I'd never seen it close before. And I was so worried that, you know, it would be an illusion, this diversity that we had, that somehow, you know, even we would be kind of swept by this ugliness. But I was bringing my son home, trying to get him a slice of pizza because I'm like a bad mom. I didn't have any food in the house. And I realized I saw so many of the cops and so many of the police officers out there were women. And a lot of them were women of color. You know, some of them were like very butch ladies. Also, like some of the white women, like they were just all, and I do not know what possessed me, but Javi was so scared. God knows what, he was probably sensing my anxiety. And I said, you know, Javi, come look, there's mommy cops too. Come meet some mommy cops. And one of the women said, you know, oh yeah, I have 2 kids. And the other one said, I have 3. You want to take a picture? And I realized I felt so safe. You know, I felt if it had been a bunch of the sort of young white male cops on TV, you know, those like phalanxes of 20-somethings that were like punching people, and, you know, I don't know how I would have felt. It's not who the cops are in Jersey City, but knowing that there were women and mothers there just made me feel safe. And it made Javi feel safe too. You know, my mother, I can't remember, my mother unfortunately just died 2 months ago, and I can't remember if she had just died or was just about to die when I wrote that piece. But, you know, the cops looked like his grandma. They looked like all the pictures we had around the houses. And, you know, I was sort of comforting him, but I was also really, you know, comforting myself. And I do not know what I would have done if I had been in another town and it hadn't looked like that. It would have been very scary to me. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I know that you're I feel like this conversation is like a legacy to your mom, because I know she was a literature professor, and so we can invoke her memory and honor her as you honor her all the time, just by being you.
She was a good mom. She gave me a lot, so I'm always glad to let the world know a little bit more about her.
And I think, I loved that piece, because I think it so spoke to that sense of like, how do we all, in these moments where people are kind of, scared and feeling alienated from each other, find the humanity and, sort of recognize common humanity and realize that like we may be on opposite sides of barricades, and our jobs and politics may place us in different positions, but that there are other things that we have in common, which I think is just, it's hard. It's really, really hard to see that sometimes.
Oh,
and
yeah.
to figure out ways that we can like call that up and, model that, or like help our kids see that, is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't want him to be afraid of police officers. I also reminded him, my Black grandfather was an ATF officer. So I showed it. So it's like, I want him to be able to understand the complexity of the world, but it's so hard. I mean, now it's impossible. How is he supposed to understand any of this? But I think that's what's inspired a lot of my writing about parenthood lately. I'm sure just in normal days, I would be thinking about my mother and my son, and, but between the pandemic and, the uprisings, he was an ATF agent, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. I love how I keep leaning forward. I try to like talk to the chat box. But I'm really glad the Times has been letting me write on everything about parenting. So it's really helpful to me.
Well, and it's also such an interesting thing, because I feel like there still is some like way that people can be very demeaning about writing about parenting. Like, like the way people used to talk about like mommy blogging, as if that were somehow different than just people writing about their lives. Right. And I remember once I had written an article, which actually was not about parenthood, it was about Jewish education, but I was talking about something and I used the metaphor of the sandbox. And I was like, we have to get our hands dirty in the sandbox. And someone who I worked with actually said like, well, it's clear where you're spending a lot of time, in this kind of like somewhat like a put down kind of way. And I was sort of like, right, well, that's what good writers do, is actually make use of the things that are common to our experience and use them as ways of talking about bigger things, right? And like, that's actually what makes writing relatable and powerful and speak to people. And somehow there's a way in which, again, and this circles back to, Pretty Bitches, like there's a way in which when women do that, it somehow is seen as less than or not important. Or
I know. I mean, I felt like if I were writing about, I wrote a huge book about female authors, paying attention to female authors, and nobody saw it that way. They just slapped a pink cover on it and put flowers all over it. And I was like, okay, but like, I really am writing a book about like a canon, but I guess if you need to put flowers on it to sell it, go for it. So, yeah. Oh, well.
Right. It is very hard to break out of those sense. And it gets back to some of the, like the words thing, right? Like the kinds of, so many of the words that are used against women are to sort of like make that point, like you don't have authority, you don't have gravitas, right. You don't have, power in these various ways. And then to make that, to not only say that, but then to make it true.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember when I first started doing all the shelf discovery books, men would always say like, oh, books for girls. And I would say, yeah, that's a good thing. That's great. Right. Books for girls. I hope you don't have a daughter someday, because, I hope you're more respectful about the books she likes to read.
Right, exactly. Well, thank you so much, Lizzie. This was really, really fun. And I always feel like I learn from you when we get to talk, and I love to read the things that you put out there. So please keep writing and keep publishing and telling us things to read. Thank you for being with us tonight. And thanks to all of you who joined us. Thanks for your great questions. And I hope that you will be back next week with us, same time, same place, for a conversation with Natasha Diaz about her novel, Color Me In, which is a coming of age story about a biracial Jewish girl, actually. So we'll be continuing on some of these themes.
I want to read it now.
Yeah, definitely read it. Come back, join the conversation next week. Thank you so much, all of you. Until next time, be well, good night, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to meet you all virtually, everybody. Bye-bye. I have to go get my son now.
Bye.